The experience of loneliness, though feared and avoided by the modern psyche as though it were a pestilence to be driven out at any cost, reveals itself upon closer examination to be not merely an absence, not merely the barren wasteland of human connection, but rather a secret crucible, a hidden vessel in which the neglected aspects of the soul are compelled into confrontation with one another. And it is within this confrontation that the true alchemy of transformation occurs, though one must be careful here to avoid trivializing what I mean by alchemy, for I do not refer to the vulgar attempt to transmute lead into gold in its material form, but rather to that inner work, the opus, in which the base elements of human experience, the shadowed and unwanted feelings, the griefs and longings, the unendurable awareness of separation, are subjected to the fire of solitude until, through suffering and reflection, they reveal the shining metal of inner meaning. Thus loneliness, if one has the courage to endure it without fleeing into distractions, becomes the psychic furnace in which the ego is dissolved and reconstituted in a more expansive form, drawing closer to what I have elsewhere described as the self, that archetypal totality which is never fully possessed but toward which the individuation process points. And therefore one must not mistake loneliness for a mere psychological defect, a symptom to be anesthetized with constant company or ceaseless diversion, but rather one should consider whether within the silence of isolation lies the voice of the deeper self, calling us back from the noise of the collective to the original ground of being where the opposites are reconciled. The difficulty, of course, is that modern culture has rendered us ill-equipped for such silence, surrounding us from birth with the noise of opinions, the flood of images, the false intimacy of endless communication that conceals a profound inner poverty, so that when the individual at last finds himself alone, stripped of these external voices, he feels terror, as though cast adrift on a sea without compass, for the psyche, having long relied on the projections of others, suddenly finds itself face to face with the uncanny depths of its own interior, and yet, paradoxically, it is precisely this terror, this confrontation with inner nothingness, that is the first step toward inner gold. For the soul must encounter its own void in order to recognize the hidden spark that lies beneath it, the scintilla of the divine image, the imago Dei, which, though covered over by the distractions of daily life, remains indestructible within the human being, waiting for such moments of crisis to emerge into awareness. One could say that loneliness is the summons of the unconscious itself, demanding that what has been neglected or forgotten be brought into the light. And here lies the great alchemical mystery, that the stone rejected by the builders becomes the cornerstone, that the very condition most despised by man, his sense of alienation, becomes the portal to his deepest wholeness. For in loneliness the individual is forced to turn inward, and in this turning he may discover that the figures which arise in his imagination shadows, anima or animus, old gods half remembered are, not merely phantoms but fragments of his own psychic reality demanding recognition. Indeed, the alchemists spoke of the Nigredo, the blackening, as the first stage of transformation, when all matter is reduced to chaos and decay before any possibility of renewal can occur. And loneliness in its rawest form is nothing other than this Nigredo of the soul, the moment when the ego's constructions collapse and one stands before the abyss. But if one has the patience to endure the darkness without denial, to suffer it without fleeing, then gradually out of the chaos new images arise, new connections form, and the stone begins its transformation. It is no accident that so many of the mystics, prophets, and thinkers of humanity were driven into solitude, often against their will. yet in that solitude discovered revelations that would not have been possible in the marketplace of constant chatter. For the archetype of the hermit, present in every tradition, symbolizes the timeless truth that withdrawal from the world is necessary for contact with the source, and that the treasures of wisdom are most often won at the cost of abandonment, exile, or self-imposed retreat. Therefore, when one feels the weight of loneliness pressing upon the heart, one should not rush too quickly to banish it, but rather one might ask, what is it that this solitude wishes to teach me? What gold lies hidden in this leaden heaviness? For it is a psychological law that what we resist persists, and what we embrace transforms. Thus loneliness, when embraced consciously, reveals itself not as emptiness but as fullness, not as the absence of connection but as the presence of the deepest connection, the connection with the self, which once encountered allows all outer connections to be reframed in their true proportion, no longer as desperate attempts to avoid our inner void, but as free expressions of relatedness, grounded in wholeness. Yet I must emphasize that this alchemy is not a simple or sentimental process, for the fire that transforms lead into gold is also the fire that burns, and loneliness can sear the soul with despair if endured without meaning. Hence the necessity of symbolic work, of dreams, of active imagination, whereby the unconscious contents revealed in solitude can be engaged rather than suppressed. For it is in this dialogue with the unconscious that the prima materia of our loneliness is slowly transformed into the living symbol that unites conscious and unconscious in a higher synthesis. In this way, the alchemy of loneliness is inseparable from the individuation process itself, for the ego, in its isolation, becomes aware of its limits and, forced by necessity, opens itself to the transpersonal dimension, and thus the experience of abandonment, rather than destroying the psyche, may become the condition for its expansion beyond the narrow confines of personal desire. Indeed, the paradox is profound, that the more fully one accepts one's isolation, the more one discovers a universal connectedness. For within the depths of the solitary soul lies the archetypal pattern shared by all, and in touching the self, one touches the common source of humanity. Thus the gold born of loneliness is not merely a private treasure, but a gift that radiates outward, enabling the individual to return to the world with a deeper capacity for compassion. For one who has endured the crucible of solitude without fleeing learns to recognize, in the eyes of others, that same hidden struggle, that same longing for meaning, and thus relationships are no longer founded upon mutual avoidance of loneliness, but upon mutual recognition of the divine spark that solitude has revealed. And yet, the path through loneliness is not merely a matter of passive endurance, but of conscious participation in the mystery unfolding within. For the psyche does not transform automatically without the involvement of the ego, and thus the one who suffers solitude must also engage it, must listen to the whispers of dreams, must watch the subtle moods and images that rise like vapors from the unconscious, and must take them seriously as messages from a deeper source. For it is precisely in these symbolic expressions that the hidden gold begins to glimmer. Consider how often in the dream life of the lonely person there appear images of forgotten companions, of strange strangers, of luminous figures that both console and terrify, and if these are dismissed as mere fantasies, the gift they bring is lost, but if they are honored as expressions of the psyche's attempt to restore wholeness, then loneliness ceases to be barren isolation and becomes the secret workshop of the soul. Here lies the difference between neurosis and transformation, for in neurosis the individual flees from the voices of the unconscious, treating loneliness as a curse to be eradicated, while in transformation the same loneliness is embraced as the ground of encounter, and the soul, no longer shrinking, dares to enter the cave where the treasure lies hidden. Indeed, in countless myths the hero is separated from his companions, cast into exile, or abandoned in the wilderness, and only there, in utter solitude, does he find the object of his quest, be it the golden fleece, the holy grail, or the inner pearl of great price. And this mythological pattern reveals a psychological truth that individuation requires: the stripping away of external securities so that the individual may discover the inner axis around which life truly revolves. Thus, loneliness is not simply a personal misfortune, but an archetypal initiation, a rite of passage demanded of every soul that would become whole. And it is only our modern refusal to recognize the symbolic dimension of experience that makes loneliness appear merely pathological. But if we recover the symbolic eye, the vision of the alchemists, the mystics, the poets, then we see that what seems like death is in fact a preparation for rebirth. What feels like exile is in truth a journey to the center. If in the first phase of our descent into the mystery of loneliness we beheld its nature as Nigredo, the blackening and disintegration of the ego's false certainties, we must now recognize that this darkness, if endured without escape, begins to yield unexpected illuminations. For in the very act of being stripped bare of outer attachments, the soul discovers that it has not in fact been abandoned to nothingness, but has been returned to its own inner ground, a ground rich with images, archetypes, and forgotten energies, which reveal themselves gradually like stars emerging in a night sky. And this dawning is akin to what the alchemists called the albedo, the whitening, the gentle light that follows the chaos of the blackening, in which the first glimmers of order appear, and the soul begins to perceive that its isolation has concealed within it a secret companionship. For the unconscious is never empty. It is peopled with figures that the ego has ignored in its flight toward outer distractions, and now these figures come forward demanding to be seen, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in sudden moods, sometimes in uncanny intuitions that break through the silence of solitude. Here, the lonely one encounters what Jung named the anima or animus, the contrasexual figure within who carries the promise of relation to the unconscious. And often it is in the long night of loneliness that such figures appear most vividly, reminding the ego that though it may feel abandoned in the world, it is still connected to a larger psychic whole. And if the ego has the courage to enter into dialogue with these figures rather than repress them, then loneliness begins to be transfigured, for what once felt like a sterile desert becomes a fertile field of symbols. And this is the true beginning of the inner gold, the realization that in being cut off from others one is paradoxically drawn into deeper relation with the self, that totality of being which transcends and yet includes the ego, and thus loneliness, once accepted, becomes not emptiness but fullness, not isolation but a bridge to the innermost source. Yet this whitening, this emergence of hidden meaning, does not arrive without danger. For the one who enters into dialogue with unconscious figures may be overwhelmed if he identifies with them, mistaking the archetypal image for his own ego. And here we see why many who fall into loneliness succumb to fantasy, delusion, or obsession, for the psyche's attempt at compensation can flood the unprepared mind, and the task of consciousness is to hold the tension, to honor the figures without collapsing into them, to treat them as symbols rather than literal beings. For it is only when the ego can relate to the unconscious without being devoured by it that true transformation occurs. Thus the albedo stage demands discernment, patience, and symbolic awareness, qualities that modern man, trained only in literal thinking, often lacks, which is why loneliness so often leads to despair rather than renewal, for without the symbolic attitude the sufferer sees only absence and not presence, only loss and not gift. And yet, for those who endure, there emerges slowly the realization that loneliness itself is a form of initiation, an ordeal demanded by the archetype of individuation, whereby the individual must leave the collective, as the hero must leave the village and enter the wilderness alone. For only in that wilderness can the deeper sources of the psyche be encountered, and thus the albedo is experienced as a kind of dawning hope, a recognition that the silence of solitude is filled with meaning, that the figures which appear are guides rather than enemies, and that the soul, far from being abandoned, is in fact accompanied by forces larger than itself. In this sense, loneliness becomes a sanctuary, a hidden temple where the dialogue between ego and self may unfold. And though the process remains painful, it also becomes suffused with a quiet radiance, for one begins to sense that the suffering of solitude is not meaningless but purposeful, a shaping fire that prepares the soul for a deeper wholeness. Consider how often, in the great spiritual traditions, withdrawal into solitude is presented as necessary for revelation. Moses ascends the mountain alone. The Buddha sits beneath the Bodhi tree, abandoned by his companions. Christ retreats into the desert, and each of these figures confronts the loneliness of separation before receiving the vision that grounds their mission. These myths are not mere historical records but archetypal patterns, showing us that the encounter with the self requires the stripping away of outer ties, and thus our personal loneliness, however banal or painful it may appear, participates in this universal mystery, linking us to a lineage of seekers who found in solitude the doorway to transformation. What then is the task of the one who suffers loneliness in our own age of distraction? It is not to flee from it into endless noise, nor to collapse into despair, but to recognize in it the alchemical vessel, to remain with it long enough that the blackness gives way to whitening, that out of the silence the hidden companions emerge, that the barren wasteland reveals itself as the place of treasure. For only then does loneliness turn from curse to blessing, only then does the soul begin to taste the inner gold dot, and in this unfolding whitening of the soul's solitude, there arises another paradox which the alchemists knew well, that the work is not only destructive and not only creative, but always both at once. A simultaneous dissolution and coagulation solve et coagula, for as old identifications dissolve, new constellations of meaning form, and the ego discovers that what appeared to be loss is in fact the ground for integration, the weaving together of opposites into a higher unity, and thus loneliness, when consciously endured, becomes the very place where contradiction is reconciled, where the longing for connection is transmuted into a deeper relatedness that no longer depends upon external validation but flows from the wellspring of the self, a relatedness that is at once inward and outward, for one cannot encounter the archetypal images of the unconscious without also being drawn into the archetypal drama of humanity as a whole. And in this way the lonely one slowly perceives that he is not truly alone but joined invisibly to all who have walked this path, the mystics, the exiles, the visionaries, the forsaken, and thus his pain acquires meaning as participation in a universal mystery. It is in this sense that loneliness becomes sacred, for the silence of isolation begins to echo with the voices of the eternal, and the images that arise in dreams or contemplations, symbols of death and rebirth, of union and separation, of darkness and light, not private fantasies, but archetypal truths through which the self speaks. And if these truths are honored, if the individual can allow them to reshape his understanding, then the ego gradually shifts from despair to reverence, from resistance to acceptance, and the alchemical work deepens. But we must acknowledge that this path is never linear, that loneliness does not simply dissolve into peace once its meaning is glimpsed, but often returns in waves, sometimes darker than before, and each return demands a renewed surrender, for the psyche resists transformation and clings to old securities, and thus the lonely one must repeatedly let go, must repeatedly face the terror of emptiness until it becomes familiar, until what once was unbearable becomes the very substance of strength. Here lies the true alchemy, not a single event, but an ongoing opus, a daily labor in which solitude is accepted again and again until its gold is fully refined. And in this labor the soul discovers its resilience, discovers that it can endure without collapse, that it can hold the opposites of presence and absence, longing and fulfillment, and in so doing the ego is slowly reshaped into a vessel capable of carrying the radiance of the self. This is why the alchemists spoke of patience. Above all, for the transformation cannot be rushed, and why Jung reminded us that individuation is not an achievement but a lifelong process. And so to loneliness, when transfigured, does not vanish, but becomes a companion, a silent teacher who walks with us through the years, reminding us that the deepest connection is not given by others, but discovered within, and that from this inner ground all authentic relations with others may flower. Thus the whitening is not the end, but the beginning, a preparation for the Rubedo, the reddening, when the gold of inner wholeness shines forth into the world, and though that lies ahead, already in the whitening we taste its promise, the faint glimmer of inner gold in the silence of solitude. If loneliness in its black phase shattered the ego's false securities and in its whitening phase revealed the hidden presences of the unconscious that accompany us in solitude, then the final stage of this inner alchemy, the Rubedo or reddening, is the moment when the gold that has been formed in the depths begins to radiate outward, when the fruits of isolation are no longer held as private treasures but shared with the world. For true individuation is never self-enclosure, but the capacity to bring the wholeness of the self into relation, and thus the one who has endured the long nights of solitude without fleeing, who has passed through the terrors of abandonment and the silent dialogues with inner figures, emerges with a new orientation to life, one no longer rooted in desperate clinging or compulsive avoidance, but in a quiet confidence born of the knowledge that even in utter aloneness he is connected to the deepest ground of being, and from this knowledge arises a new form of love, no longer the hungry grasping of an ego that seeks completion in another, but the radiant overflow of a soul that has discovered its own inner completeness. And therefore loneliness, once despised as a curse, has become the very condition for the possibility of authentic relationship. For only he who has learned to dwell with himself without escape can truly meet another without demand, without projection, without the secret hope that the other will silence his inner emptiness. And thus the reddening marks the stage at which isolation has been transmuted into compassion, where the gold of solitude shines not for oneself alone, but for the enrichment of all. Yet let us not romanticize this stage, for it does not mean that loneliness disappears once and for all. Rather, it becomes integrated. It becomes a presence that can be carried without fear, a reminder of the depths from which the soul draws its strength. And so the individual who has passed through this alchemy walks in the world with a peculiar aura, a gravity born of suffering endured, a light born of darkness transfigured, and it is this presence that others recognize even if they cannot name it, sensing in the one who has embraced loneliness a rare freedom, for he is no longer enslaved by the need for approval, no longer terrified of abandonment, no longer desperate for distraction, but lives from the inner axis of the self, and in this way the gold of loneliness fulfills its purpose by reconnecting the individual to life in a new way. Consider how many of the great works of art, philosophy, and spiritual vision have arisen from solitude. How often the voice that speaks most deeply to humanity is the voice that was first forged in isolation. And we see that the alchemy of loneliness is not merely a private process, but a cultural necessity. For without those who dare to endure solitude, the collective would stagnate in superficiality, addicted to noise and novelty, never touching the deeper sources of renewal, and therefore each individual who accepts the burden of loneliness contributes, not only to his own individuation, but to the transformation of the collective soul, becoming a vessel through which new symbols, new insights, new possibilities may emerge. And in this sense, the reddening is the reconciliation of the opposites we began with, for the lonely one, having passed through the abyss of isolation, now discovers a universal relatedness, an unbreakable bond with all beings grounded not in external attachment, but in the recognition of shared essence, and thus what began as separation culminates in communion. What felt like exile becomes belonging. What seemed like death is revealed as rebirth. Here the alchemical symbol of the red stone, the philosopher's stone, takes on its full meaning, for it represents the total integration of opposites, the union of spirit and matter, conscious and unconscious, self and other, and this integration is nothing other than the gold born of loneliness, the gift that arises when one has dared to turn inward rather than flee outward, when one has allowed the crucible of solitude to do its hidden work, burning away the dross of illusion until only the essence remains. And this essence, though invisible, radiates in the way one lives, in the way one loves, in the way one suffers and rejoices. For the individual who has transmuted loneliness into inner gold cannot help but embody a new possibility for humanity, showing by his very being that what we fear most may conceal what we need most, and that the path of isolation, though painful, is also the path of wholeness. Therefore, let us not despise loneliness, nor seek to eradicate it at all costs, but let us honor it as the secret alchemist of the soul, the hidden fire that, if endured with patience and openness, yields the most precious treasure of all, a life rooted in the self, radiant with compassion and reconciled with the mystery of existence. And yet, though the reddening symbolizes the culmination of the opus, we must remember that culmination is never finality, for the work of the soul is circular, the spiral, movement of descent and ascent repeating itself at ever-deepening levels. And so even the one who has tasted the gold of solitude will again and again be summoned back into the crucible. For human life is too complex, too layered, too mysterious, to yield its totality in a single transformation, and each cycle of loneliness brings new depths, new shadows, new light, until the individual begins to see that loneliness itself is not merely an obstacle but a rhythm of the psyche, a tide that carries him alternately outward toward connection and inward toward silence. And if he learns to flow with this tide rather than resist it, then loneliness ceases to be a threat and becomes a guide, a messenger of balance, reminding him when he has lost himself in the collective and needs to return to the self, or when he has become too inward and must again bring his treasures into relation with the world. In this way, the reddening is not the end of loneliness, but the reconciliation with it. The discovery that it is not an enemy to be vanquished, but a teacher to be welcomed. And those who achieve this reconciliation radiate a rare serenity, for they no longer fear isolation, nor cling compulsively to company, but move freely between the two, rooted in the awareness that both are necessary aspects of the opus. And here we touch the ethical dimension of this transformation. For the one who has carried loneliness consciously becomes capable of bearing the loneliness of others without recoiling, capable of listening deeply without needing to fill the silence, capable of offering companionship without erasing difference. And in this capacity lies the seed of true community. A community not of individuals fleeing from themselves into each other, but of individuals grounded in their own being, able to meet in freedom, and thus the alchemy of loneliness, though it begins in the solitude of the individual, culminates in a new form of collective, a communion of individuated souls whose relatedness is not based on unconscious projection but unconscious recognition. And this is perhaps the most precious gold of all, for it answers the modern predicament of alienation not with superficial remedies but with a transformation at the root, showing us that the way beyond loneliness is not to abolish it but to transmute it, not to drown it in distraction but to let it ripen into the wisdom of the heart. For when the reddening has matured, the lonely one knows that every human being carries within them the same secret furnace, the same hidden gold, and therefore he approaches others not with judgment but with reverence, knowing that beneath their masks and fears lies the same self that he has encountered in his solitude, and this recognition is the ground of compassion, a compassion that does not condescend but affirms, does not pity but honors. And it is from such compassion that true healing radiates into the world. And so the alchemy of loneliness, which begins with the terror of abandonment, ends with the embrace of all existence, the capacity to stand alone and yet feel united with the whole, to carry solitude as a flame that illumines not only one's own path but the path of others. For in the reddening, the gold of the soul is no longer hidden, but shines forth as a gift